Hello, friends. You may have heard this. Some commentators have said that using the keys to the White House, I didn't actually predict 10 out of 10 elections since 1984. They've said I predicted 9 out of 10. Still not bad, but not correct. They have focused on the hotly contested election of 2000, noting that I predicted Gore, but in fact, George W. Bush won the election when the Supreme Court stopped the recount in Florida, with Bush ahead by 537 votes. When I appeared on Bill Maher after my successful prediction of a Donald Trump win in 2016 and to give my 2020 forecast, the first thing he said to me was, "Lichtman, how did you F up 2000?" And my answer then was the same answer I've been giving for 20 years and the same answer I would share with you now. I didn't. That was a stolen election. The wrong candidate won Florida, and the wrong candidate was elected president. I'm not just saying that. I proved that in my 2001 report to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, and it's still up on their website if you want to check it out. What I looked at, and I had no opinion on this in advance of doing the study for the commission, was racial disparities in rejected ballots. 180,000 ballots in Florida were rejected as invalid. Of those ballots rejected as invalid, I looked at a comparison of the rejection rates for ballots cast by African-American voters as compared to the ballots cast by white voters. This is politically as well as racially significant because African-American voters were about 95% for Gore, whereas white voters were for Bush. What I found absolutely shocked me. I found that 1 out of every 9 to 10 ballots cast by an African-American were discarded as rejected. These weren't African-Americans who were prevented from voting. That's a whole other issue that plagued Florida's elections. These were African-Americans who thought they voted, but whose ballots weren't counted. So if you lined up 9 or 10 African-American voters, you'd pull one out and say your vote didn't count. That compared to 1 out of 50 votes discarded for white voters, 1 out of 9 to 10 for black voters versus 1 out of 50 for white voters. A shocking, enormous disparity. If in fact the rejection rate for ballots cast by black voters had not been 0, but simply equal to the rejection rate for white voters, an additional tens of thousands net black votes would have been cast in that election, and Al Gore would have won it, going away by tens of thousands of votes. Now, how was I able to create such estimates? In fact, it was quite easy in Florida because of 2 things. Number one, when you register in Florida, you register by race. So we know how many, what the percentage of black and white registered voters are in any given precinct. We know what the percentage of black and white voters are in any given precinct, because we can look at those registered voters who actually voted. We don't know how they voted, but we do know the statistical breakdown of black and white voters in a precinct. And it turns out, of course, Florida is a heavily segregated state, and precincts are very heavily racially divided. If you look at the slide of Duval County, you can see there are a lot of precincts that are overwhelmingly or nearly all white, and a good number of precincts that are overwhelmingly Black, and a lot of precincts in between. It turns out there is just an extraordinary statistical correlation, something you almost never see to this extent, between the percentage of Black voters in a precinct and the percentage of rejected ballots. It's almost a straight line relationship there in Duval County, something you never see in the real world. But it gets worse. The great majority of the rejected ballots cast by African Americans were not ballots that couldn't be read. Those weren't those hanging chads or dimples that were all over the news. No, you didn't hear about this. Most of the ballots rejected that were cast by African Americans were so-called over votes, where African Americans punched in Gore and, just to make sure, wrote in Gore. None of those ballots were counted, even though the intention of the voters was crystal clear. I further validated my 2001 study in a 2003 article in the Journal of Legal Studies. You can look that up as well in the journal. And independently, Professor Walter Mebane, in a 2004 study published in Perspective on Politics, validated my analysis from the Commission on Civil Rights paper and the Journal of Legal Studies paper. His paper was entitled, quote, "The Wrong Man is President!" Exclamation point. Overvotes in the 2000 presidential election in Florida. And he concluded, based upon the intent of voters, Al Gore, as I concluded, should have won election in Florida, not by 537 votes, but by tens of thousands of votes. And as you can see clearly from the title of his article, he agreed with me that the wrong candidate was elected in 2000, because whoever won Florida also would win the presidency. And thus, my prediction was not wrong. But beyond that, I call this the unknown scandal of the 21st century, beginning of the century, you could say the end of the 20th. Nobody seemed to care. It was just Black voters in the South, just the same old story, even though it fundamentally changed the course of American history and the course of world history. Could you have imagined that if 1 out of every 9 to 10 ballots cast by white voters in Florida had been rejected, as compared to only 1 out of 50 ballots cast by Black voters? Rush Limbaugh would have called it the crime of the century. George Will, the more erudite conservative, would have said the end of Western civilization as we know it. But because it was a scandal involving Black voters, almost nobody knows about it today. And yet the battle to enable Black voters and other minority voters to vote and have their ballots cast continues. It hasn't ended. It continues in Florida. Just recently, Florida passed a law essentially crippling the ability of third-party registration organizations like the NAACP and Hispanic organizations to register voters. By a wide margin, these organizations registered Black and Hispanic hard-to-reach communities as compared to white communities. The statistics are overwhelming, and here is Florida cracking in a way that diminishes the impact of the minority vote. You know, the players change, the issues change, but the battle for voting rights has gone on for hundreds of years in America, and sadly has not ended today.